Johnny Depp appears with a gaunt, hollow face that even his most loyal fans fail to recognize, and that is only the beginning of the darkest comeback of his career. The shocking transformation in Daydrinker is not just makeup, but a hidden truth Hollywood can no longer avoid. And behind those sunken eyes lies a revelation the film is about to force the world to confront. After the first images from Daydrinker surfaced, one question erupted across social media. Where had Johnny Depp been during the years he vanished from the spotlight? Because before stepping into the role that stunned Hollywood, Depp had already lived through a long, deliberate disappearance. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was filled with meaning. He wasn't running away. He was searching for a version of himself he had lost. And that journey began with a painful decision, leaving Hollywood, the place that once crowned him a legend but also shattered him without mercy. In the years following his legal battles with Amber Heard, Depp chose silence. No statements, no defenses, no attempts to save his public image. He retreated to Europe, living between music tours with the Hollywood vampires, where guitar strings could let him breathe, and the noise of tabloids couldn't touch him. Friends say he confessed during those late-night rehearsals that he no longer recognized himself on screen. A confession both bitter and oddly liberating. If he could no longer see himself in the roles he played, then maybe he had no choice but to tear everything down and rebuild from the ashes. Just when the world assumed Johnny Depp would fade into small indie films and dimly lit music bars, a script arrived. A dark story about collapse, addiction, and the search for identity. Director Lena Forsythe didn't hesitate. From the moment she read the first draft, she believed only Depp could carry the emotional weight of the role, only he understood what it meant to fall from grace and wander through silence. But the question lingered, would Depp have the courage to use his real wounds as material for the character? In their first meetings, Forsythe reportedly told him, "I don't need a star.
He needs a truth. Brutal.
Honest.
Irrésistible."
Depp understood instantly. If he accepted this project, he couldn't hide behind makeup or eccentric charm. He would have to strip away everything that once protected him, the persona, the humor, the legendary mystique, and step into the rawness he had avoided for years. Could he do that? Or was that the very reason he couldn't walk away? Sources close to the production revealed that Depp spent months preparing emotionally before giving Forsythe his final answer. Not because he feared failure, but because he knew portraying a man destroyed by alcoholism would force him to confront chapters of his own past he preferred to keep buried. The world sees the glamorous red carpets, but Depp remembers the nights of exhaustion, the conflicts, the blurry moments of collapse. That overlap between life and fiction terrified him, and yet it was exactly why the role mattered. Daydrinker was not simply a comeback vehicle. It became a conversation between Depp and the man he used to be. A quiet, private interrogation. Do you still deserve to stand in front of a camera? And a deeper question lingered beneath it. Would audiences accept a Johnny Depp stripped of beauty, stripped of iconography, reduced to something painfully human? This emotional gamble is what turned the role into a turning point. But beneath that choice, beneath the silence and the transformation, there remains something unexplained. Something Depp has never said out loud. What truth is he still holding back? When the first stills from Daydrinker were released, the reaction was immediate and visceral. People didn't gasp because Johnny Depp looked older. They gasped because they couldn't even recognize him. The man on the screen had hollow cheeks, cracked lips, and eyes so clouded they seemed to belong to someone who had stopped expecting anything from life. It wasn't the kind of transformation Hollywood uses for spectacle. It was the kind that carries a bruise beneath it, quiet, unsettling, and impossible to look away from. His once iconic hair, a trademark in every era of his career, had turned into a tangled mass of gray and ashen blonde strands. His shoulders slumped under a weather-beaten coat that looked too heavy for the fragile frame beneath it. Even the way he stood, slightly tilted, as if bracing against a storm only he could feel, told a story before any dialogue was spoken. What kind of pain does a man have to carry to look like that? Fans scrolled past the image, then scrolled back. Some said they had to zoom in before realizing the truth. Others insisted it couldn't be him. A few believed the photo was staged to manipulate public curiosity. But most understood something deeper. This wasn't transformation for awards or headlines. This was an actor willingly erasing everything that once made him Johnny Depp. And the question that echoed underneath every comment was simple: why? The makeup and prosthetics team later confirmed that the design was deliberate, crafted to depict not just physical decay, but spiritual erosion. sunken eyes to show the absence of hope, blotches on the skin to suggest years of neglect, subtle tremors in the hands to hint at withdrawal. The team didn't want him to look fictional. They wanted him to look forgotten. But the most haunting detail was the expression, an emptiness that couldn't be painted on. That part came from Depp himself. It was the one element no makeup artist could manufacture. Behind the scenes, the director had insisted that the transformation must reflect the character's inner collapse. A man whose days blur into nights, whose memories dissolve into hallucinations, and whose past stands like a shadow he can't outrun. The camera would linger close, revealing every crack in the facade. Nothing would be hidden. Nothing would be softened. If audiences felt uncomfortable, then the film had achieved its purpose. Yet the shockwave didn't stop with appearance alone. Once viewers started analyzing the image more carefully, they noticed parallels, subtle but unmistakable, between the character's brokenness and moments from Depp's real life.
The loneliness. The silence.
The public bruising of reputation. Could it be that the role was more than fiction? That it was, in some fragile way, a confession? Cultural critics began drawing comparisons to other legendary transformations in cinema, claiming this might be Depp's most raw and dangerous leap yet. Not because of makeup, but because of what he allowed himself to feel in front of the lens. Vulnerability, when placed under a camera, becomes a form of exposure more brutal than any scandal. As discussions continued, theories multiplied. Some wondered whether the character's despair was mirroring Depp's own private battles. Others believed the transformation was a challenge, a message to Hollywood that he was no longer interested in charm, fantasy, or box office appeal. He was here for truth, even if that truth was ugly. And buried inside the debates was a quieter, more intimate question. Did the role demand this transformation, or did Depp himself need it? Because if an actor becomes unrecognizable not just in appearance but in essence, then something profound is happening behind the scenes, something audiences are not yet being told. What, exactly, was Johnny Depp trying to show the world through this haunting new face?
When fiction mirror a man's life. The story within Daydrinker.
The plot of Daydrinker appears, at first glance, to be a simple portrait of a broken man, a former jazz musician who collapses under addiction and retreats from the world. But beneath its surface lies a narrative so intimate, so painfully reflective, that many have wondered whether Johnny Depp was chosen for the role, or whether the role chose him. Because as critics began dissecting the film's storyline, a haunting realization emerged. The character's descent does not merely resemble Depp's past, it runs parallel to it. In the film, the protagonist is a man who once lived for music. He was alive when he played. He belonged to people when he performed. But when fame faded, and loneliness settled in, he turned to alcohol as a way to silence the memories he could not reconcile. His world shrank to dimly lit bars, rain-soaked streets, and the echo of melodies he could no longer bring himself to play. The script describes him as a man who remembers too much and feels too deeply. How many times had the same words been written about Johnny Depp? Lena Forsythe, the director, insisted on weaving emotional contradictions into every scene, the beauty of jazz against the ugliness of addiction, the nostalgia of memory against the brutality of regret, the loneliness of the character against the crowds that once adored him. It was, in many ways, the same contradiction that defined Depp's public image, beloved yet haunted, admired yet misunderstood, present yet perpetually drifting away. What struck early viewers most was not the character's suffering, but the way Depp carried it. There is a moment in the film where the protagonist sits alone in a room filled with musical instruments he no longer touches. He stares at them as if they were relics of a life he has betrayed. That stillness, heavy, suffocating, wordless, felt too real to be merely acted. It felt like a man confronting the ghosts he spent years outrunning. Was Depp acting, or was he remembering? The parallels continued. In the film, the character's alcoholism isolates him from the people who once tried to love him. His family drifts away not out of anger but exhaustion. His past relationships crumble under the weight of promises he couldn't keep. And while the film is fictional, the wounds it portrays echo parts of Depp's past that were dissected mercilessly by tabloids and courtrooms. The world had watched him fight public battles over truth, reputation, and identity. They had seen him bruised by narratives that painted him as both villain and victim. And now here he was, inhabiting a character whose pain felt eerily familiar. The emotional conflict becomes even sharper in a pivotal scene where the protagonist receives a visit from someone who represents the last vestige of hope in his life. She is not a savior, she is a mirror. She asks him the one question he has avoided: when was the last time you were honest with yourself? In the footage, Depp's reaction is so fraught, so raw, that some crew members reportedly believed he momentarily forgot he was filming. It was not a line being delivered, it was a wound being reopened. The cinematic tension between the character's internal collapse and Depp's real-life turmoil blurs the boundaries between fiction and confession. It is why many critics have begun calling Daydrinker the closest thing to a self-portrait Johnny Depp has ever allowed. And perhaps that is why the transformation feels more unsettling than any he has done before, not because it's dramatic, but because it's true. As the story unfolds, the character attempts to reconnect with the world he abandoned. He attends a jazz performance, hiding in the shadows, watching younger musicians play with the fire he once had. The camera lingers on his face as admiration and grief collide. It is a look audiences have seen on Depp before, during award ceremonies, in interviews, in quiet moments backstage. A tenderness mixed with sorrow, as though life had given him too much and taken too much in return. This attempt at redemption becomes the emotional spine of the film. But redemption in Daydrinker is not glamorous. It is not triumphant. It is slow, fragile, and uncertain. Every step forward risks a fall.
Every moment of clarity risque a relapse.
The film does not promise transformation, it merely offers the possibility of it. And that subtlety makes the narrative more honest than any Hollywood comeback story. But the question remains. Is the character trying to heal, or is he merely trying to survive another day? And more disturbingly, is Johnny Depp asking himself the same question? Because as fiction and reality intertwine, one can't help but wonder. What part of this story belongs to the character? And what part belongs to Depp himself?
Inside the making of Daydrinker, the pain, the discipline, and the collapse behind the camera.
If Daydrinker shocks audiences with its raw imagery, the behind-the-scenes story is even more haunting. The transformation Johnny Depp achieved on screen did not come from makeup alone. It was born from a method of immersion so intense that many crew members admitted they had never witnessed anything like it in their careers. What Depp delivered in front of the camera was extraordinary, but what he lived through behind it was something far deeper, almost ritualistic. The film's setting, New Orleans, was chosen deliberately.
Director Lena Forsythe wanted a city with soul, a place where beauty and decay coexist in every alley, every bar, every shadow doorway.
She wanted a backdrop that breathed melancholy. And New Orleans, with its rain-slicked streets, aging jazz clubs, and humid nights heavy with memory, provided exactly that. But for Depp, the location became more than a backdrop. It became a psychological chamber. A place where he could disappear into the character, where the weight of the city's history and sorrow pressed gently but insistently against his own. Crew members described how he often wandered the empty streets after shooting, staying in character, his posture still bent, his eyes distant. He wasn't performing. He was existing. Inside the set, the atmosphere was strangely reverent. The cinematographer, Giancarlo Reyes, spoke in interviews about how even the lighting was designed around Depp's emotional state. "We followed his shadows," he said. "We let the darkness sit on him." Scenes were lit with muted tones, faded blues, bruised browns, the kind of colors that suggest a life leaking away slowly. Every frame looked as though it was on the verge of peeling, and that visual fragility echoed the fragility Depp brought to the role. Then there was the physical transformation. The prosthetics team, led by Mara Dri, spent hours applying subtle but devastating details: liver spots, dryness around the eyes, hair that looked unwashed for weeks, the faint tremors of a man who drinks more by morning than most do in a week. But Dri emphasized repeatedly that the final result depended on Depp. "We created the mask," she said. "He brought the soul." And that soul, fractured, exhausted, searching, became evident in the most unpredictable ways. Actors are often told to stay relaxed between takes, to conserve emotional energy. Depp did the opposite. He retreated to corners of the set, keeping to himself, speaking little, letting the emotional residue of the character cling to him. Naomi Watts, who plays the social worker attempting to pull him out of his spiral, described the experience as standing next to a man who was breaking in real time. There were moments where she wasn't sure whether he was acting or unraveling. One particular scene became the subject of quiet whispers among the crew. It involved a confession, a moment when the character finally articulates the regret he has avoided for years. The monologue was scripted to be tense but controlled. Instead, when the cameras rolled, Depp broke. Not in a theatrical way, not in an awards-baiting way, but in a painfully human way. Tears came suddenly, violently. His voice faltered. His hands shook as if he were reliving something too personal to name.
The room froze.
Lighting technicians stopped adjusting equipment. Assistants stopped breathing. Even Forsyth, known for her unflinching direction, did not call cut. She let the moment unfold like a wound opening. And when the scene ended, several crew members were in tears, not because of the story, but because it felt like they had witnessed something real, something private, something that perhaps Depp himself had never intended to reveal. Forsyth later admitted in an interview that she kept the take not only because it was powerful, but because it felt truthful. Johnny wasn't performing grief, she said. He was remembering it. As filming continued, the emotional intensity never lifted. Scenes that seemed simple on paper became crucibles on set.
Sitting at a bar, staring at un touche de glace.
Standing in the rain, unable to walk away. Watching musicians through a cracked window. In each moment, Depp offered variations of the same internal struggle, a man trying to decide whether he wants to live or simply stop hurting. The crew began adjusting their own behavior accordingly. Sound engineers kept a wider silence during takes. Camera operators moved more slowly. No one wanted to disturb the delicate emotional state Depp brought with him. Even those who weren't normally affected by performances, security guards, set builders, caterers, found themselves staying after hours just to watch the scenes unfold. It was as if the entire set had become a sanctuary for something sacred and sorrowful. But the question hanging over the production was one that no one dared ask directly. Was Depp losing himself in the role, or was he finally allowing himself to be found? Because night after night, as he walked away from the set with the same hollow stare and fragile steps as his character, one thing became increasingly unclear. Where did the performance end? And where did the man begin? The reaction, when a performance becomes a cultural earthquake. When the first official images of Daydrinker circulated, the reaction was not merely enthusiastic, it was seismic. Within hours, social media fractured into debate. Film forums lit up with theories. Commentators began speaking about Johnny Depp not as a returning star, but as a man transformed.
A man reborn trop ruin.
Some fans praised him with almost reverent admiration. They wrote that no actor had dared to appear so fragile, so deteriorated, so stripped of vanity in decades. To them, the transformation represented courage, the willingness to abandon glamour for truth. For many who had followed him through public trials and private turmoil, it felt like Depp was finally letting the world see the wounds he had been hiding for years. Others responded with fear. They wondered whether the transformation had gone too far. Was Depp sacrificing his health for authenticity? Was he collapsing under the methodological weight of the performance? Rumors spread that he had isolated himself during filming, that he barely spoke between takes, that the darkness on screen might not simply be acting. And underneath those concerns lay a deeper question. What happens when an actor digs too deeply into his own pain? Industry insiders, however, saw something different, something larger. They saw a shift in narrative, a realignment of a long misunderstood public figure. For years, Depp's image had been shaped and distorted by courtrooms, tabloids, and polarized opinion. But Daydrinker offered something those battles never could: emotional clarity. A story that wasn't filtered through lawyers or journalists, but expressed through art. It wasn't long before critics began whispering that this might be the most important performance of Depp's career. Not because it was showy, but because it was honest. They noted the stillness, the restraint, the quiet devastation he brought to the screen. They compared the transformation to icons of cinematic reinvention, roles that forced audiences to revise their understanding of an actor entirely. And for the first time in years, the conversation surrounding Johnny Depp shifted away from scandal and toward legacy. Studio executives who had once hesitated to work with him began speaking with newfound confidence. Award strategists circulated internal memos calling Daydrinker a potential contender. Film festivals expressed interest in early screenings. The narrative was changing. Slowly, cautiously, but undeniably. Yet the most revealing reaction came not from critics or executives, but from ordinary viewers who saw their own struggles reflected in the character's brokenness. Messages poured in from people describing battles with addiction, depression, and the loneliness that creeps into the soul when the world stops listening. They said Depp's face, haunted, tired, lost, looked like theirs. They thanked him for showing a truth they recognized but rarely spoke aloud. That emotional resonance became the film's unexpected power. Because Daydrinker was never meant to be entertainment. It was a confrontation. A mirror held up not only to Depp, but to anyone who has ever felt themselves slipping beneath the surface of their own life. But the question remains, one that echoes beneath every review, every fan message, every whispered awards prediction. If this performance becomes the defining moment of Depp's career, what does it say about the pain required to create it? And more urgently, can a man walk away from a role this heavy without leaving pieces of himself behind?
Daydrinker and the birth of a new artistic identity.
As the final scenes of Daydrinker unfold, a realization settles over the audience. This film is not merely an artistic project. It is a statement.
A reckoning.
A quiet rebellion against everything Johnny Depp once embodied and everything Hollywood once expected of him. The unrecognizable face, the trembling hands, the exhausted posture, none of it exists for spectacle. All of it forms a portrait of a man stripping himself down to the last truth he can bear to share. In the film's closing moments, the protagonist does not find redemption in the traditional sense.
There is no triomphe en musique, no grand révélation, no soudaine transformation.
Instead, he finds something smaller, and far more honest, the willingness to try again tomorrow. For a man who has spent years drowning in silence and self-destruction, that small flicker of resolve becomes monumental. It turns survival itself into an act of courage. That, perhaps, is the true heart of Daydrinker. It refuses to offer easy answers. It refuses to glamorize pain. Instead, it reveals the quiet, fragile process of healing, one that moves without certainty, without promises, and without applause. And the deeper viewers fall into the story, the more they realize that the film is not only a narrative about addiction. It is a meditation on what it means to be human. For Depp, the role seems to mark a turning point, a deliberate shedding of everything that once defined his career.
The flamboyant costume.
The eccentric characters.
The myth-making charm.
All replaced by stillness, vulnerability, and a rawness that feels almost uncomfortable to witness. He is no longer performing for admiration. He is performing for truth. And in doing so, he steps into an artistic space he has never occupied before. Industry analysts have already begun calling Daydrinker the beginning of Depp's third era, a phase not built on blockbusters or fantasy, but on emotional excavation. If the predictions are correct, the film may propel him into a new category of recognition, not as a comeback icon, but as an actor of profound psychological depth. Someone who has lived enough, lost enough, and learned enough to carry the heaviest stories with quiet authority. And audiences feel that weight. Not as spectacle, but as recognition. In the character's shattered expression, they see their own moments of despair. In his longing for connection, they remember their own unanswered hopes. In his attempt to stand up again, they find the echo of their own attempts. Daydrinker becomes not a movie, but a mirror, one that reflects the hidden fractures beneath the surface of ordinary lives. But perhaps the most powerful revelation is what the film suggests about Depp himself. That the man who once enchanted the world with whimsy now captivates it with honesty. That the actor who once vanished behind characters now stands exposed as ever. And that the wounds he reveals on screen are not meant to shock but to speak, to anyone who has ever known pain or failure, or the lonely task of rebuilding. As the credits roll, one question lingers, quiet but persistent. What comes after a performance that lays a man bare? And even more haunting. If Johnny Depp has finally found truth in his art, what truth will he dare to confront next?